A Korean mafia boss refused to love a black woman until one night cost him everything. 1:47 a.m., Miami, Florida. Dokgo Jin sat in his black Mercedes S-Class outside the Biltmore Hotel in Coral Gables, engine humming, fingers gripping the leather steering wheel like it was the only thing keeping him from doing something irreversible. The dashboard radio played WSVN Channel 7 quietly, the anchor's voice sharp and clinical as she reported a late-night incident involving an unnamed international art benefactor. That benefactor was Elodie Beaumont. Jin's phone vibrated on the center console for the 14th time in 6 minutes. He didn't need to look at the screen to know who it was. His lieutenants, his accountant, his fixer. Everyone wanted to know what he was going to do about the problem. Everyone wanted orders. But Jin couldn't move, because stepping out of this car meant choosing between the life he'd built with blood and precision and the woman who'd made him question every rule he'd ever sworn by. He stared at the hotel entrance, the soft glow of chandeliers spilling through the arched windows, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Fear, not of violence, not of loss, but of the man he might become if he walked through those doors. Have you ever loved someone so wrong for your world that even standing near them felt like a mistake you couldn't undo? If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 1,000 subscribers this week, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Dokgo Jin had a rule about black women. He never said it out loud, never wrote it down. Never had to. It was woven into the fabric of how he moved through Miami, silent and absolute as gravity. In his world, where every handshake carried weight and every glance could be interpreted as respect or insult, Jin had learned early that survival meant control. Control over who you trusted. Control over who you loved. Control over who you let close enough to see the man beneath the reputation. Black women, in Jin's mind, were a complication he couldn't afford. It wasn't hatred. It wasn't disgust. It was calculus. Jin operated in a world where his Korean heritage was both his armor and his cage. His family's connections in Seoul, his business partners in Busan, the silent investors who kept their money clean by keeping their distance, all of them expected him to maintain certain appearances. To marry the right kind of woman, to father the right kind of heirs, to preserve the bloodline that justified their trust. So Jin kept his distance. He was polite at fundraisers, professional at gallery openings, courteous in business dealings, but he never lingered, never asked questions, never allowed his gaze to stay too long on dark skin, textured hair, or the kind of beauty that didn't fit the mold his world demanded. Until Elodie Beaumont. 4:39 p.m., Miamidesigndistrict. The first time Jin saw her, she was standing in the middle of the Locust project's gallery, hands on her hips, arguing with the contractor about the angle of a light installation. She wore a cream linen blazer over a black tank top, high-waisted jeans, and white Converse that somehow looked elegant instead of casual. Her hair was pulled back in a low bun, a few coils escaping to frame her face. She was beautiful, yes, but that wasn't what stopped Jin in his tracks. It was the way she commanded the room. No raised voice, no theatrical gestures, just quiet, unshakable certainty. The contractor, a white man twice her age, nodded and adjusted the light exactly where she pointed. Around her, the gallery staff moved with purpose, responding to her presence the way planets respond to the sun. Jin had come to the design district to meet with a business associate who laundered money through art sales. The meeting was routine, boring even, but when he walked past the Locust projects and saw Elodie through the window, something in him stopped calculating and started watching. She turned, catching his gaze through the glass. For a moment, their eyes met. She didn't smile, didn't look away, just held his stare with the kind of calm curiosity that felt like a challenge. Jin broke first. He walked into the gallery, hands in the pockets of his tailored charcoal suit, and approached her with the same measured confidence he used in boardrooms and backrooms alike. "You're Elodie Beaumont," he said. It wasn't a question. She tilted her head slightly, studying him the way one might study a painting they weren't sure they liked. "And you're Dokgo Jin?" He raised an eyebrow. "You know who I am." "Everyone knows who you are," she said evenly. "You're the man who buys buildings in Wynwood and somehow never has construction delays. You're the man who shows up at Art Basel with a checkbook but never bids on anything publicly. You're the man people whisper about but never name." Jin's expression didn't change, but something in his chest tightened. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't impressed. She was simply stating facts, the way a meteorologist might describe a storm. "And you," Jin said carefully, "are the woman who turned the Overtown Cultural Center from a community afterthought into the most talked-about venue in Miami." Elodie's lips curved slightly, not quite a smile. "You've done your research." "I always do." She crossed her arms, the gesture somehow both defensive and dismissive. "So, what brings you to my gallery, Mr. Dokgo? You don't strike me as the abstract art type." Jin glanced at the installation behind her, a series of suspended mirrors reflecting fragmented light across the white walls. "I'm not," he admitted, "but I'm interested in people who build things that last." "Is that what you do?" Elodie asked, her tone light but pointed. "Build things that last?" Jin met her gaze, and for the first time in years, he didn't have a ready answer. Because the truth was complicated. The truth was that Jin built empires on foundations of fear and silence, and nothing about that felt like it was built to last. "Not really. I'm working on it," he said finally. Elodie studied him for a long moment, then turned back to the installation. "The light's still wrong," she said, more to herself than to him. "It's supposed to feel like hope breaking through, not just reflection." Jin watched her, this woman who spoke about light and hope like they were tangible things, and felt the first crack in the rule he'd built his life around. He left the gallery without another word, walked back to his car, drove to his penthouse overlooking Biscayne Bay, and tried to convince himself that Elodie Beaumont was just another curiosity in a city full of them. But the rule was already breaking, and Jin, for all his control, couldn't stop it. If this moment made you feel something, if you're wondering what a man like Dokgo Jin wants with a woman like Elodie Beaumont, subscribe now. Beaumont didn't think about Dokgo Jin after he left her gallery. She had a grant proposal due by midnight, a board meeting with the Overtown Cultural Center in the morning, and a sculpture installation that was 3 days behind schedule. Men like Jin, wealthy, powerful, quietly dangerous, drifted in and out of her world all the time. Miami was full of them. They came to the galleries during Art Basel. They wrote checks to feel cultured. They asked her to lunch and acted surprised when she said no. Jin was different in execution, maybe, but not in essence. Or so she thought. What Elodie didn't know was that Jin had started showing up. Not to her gallery, that would have been too obvious, but to places adjacent to her life. The coffee shop in Wynwood where she met with artists every Thursday morning. The farmer's market in Coconut Grove where she bought fresh flowers for her office. The waterfront park near Vizcaya Museum where she jogged 3 times a week. Jin didn't approach her, didn't speak, just watched from a distance, trying to understand what made her so different from every other woman he'd ever known. Elodie, meanwhile, was busy being loved, not by a man, by a city. She walked through Overtown, and people called her by name. Shop owners saved her the good mangoes. Older women kissed her cheek and asked about her mother. Children ran up to show her drawings they'd made in the after-school program she'd fought to fund. Elodie didn't move through Miami like she owned it. She moved through it like she belonged to it, and it belonged to her. Jin saw this, and it unsettled him, because in his world, power was about distance. You stayed above. You stayed untouchable. You made people need you, but you never needed them back. Elodie's power was the opposite. She was woven into the fabric of her community, so tightly that pulling her out would unravel everything around her. 11:23 a.m. Wynwood Walls. Jean finally approached her again 2 weeks after their first meeting. She was standing in front of a massive mural, taking notes on her phone, her hair loose and wild in the humid Miami air. She wore a yellow sundress and sandals, looking nothing like the polished curator he'd met before. "You're following me," Elodie said without turning around. Jean stopped a few feet behind her, genuinely surprised. "How did you know I was here?" She glanced over her shoulder, one eyebrow raised. "Because you're not subtle, Mr. Dokgo. You've been showing up in places I frequent for 2 weeks. Either you're following me, or you've suddenly developed an intense passion for farmers markets and public art." Jin's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being caught. "I wanted to see you again." "Why?" "Because I can't figure you out." Elodie turned fully to face him, and for the first time, Jean saw something like amusement in her eyes. "Is that what this is? A puzzle for you to solve?" "No," Jean said, and he meant it. "It's more complicated than that." Elodie crossed her arms, the same gesture she'd used in the gallery, and Jean realized it wasn't defensive at all. It was the posture of someone who knew exactly who they were and didn't need to prove it. "Let me save you some time," Elodie said. "I'm not interested in whatever this is. You're charming in a dangerous kind of way, and I'm sure that works on a lot of women. But I know who you are, Jean. I know what you do. And I've spent my entire life building something real in this city. I'm not going to risk it for a man who treats people like investments." Jean felt the words land like punches. Clean. Precise. "True. You don't know me," he said quietly. "I know enough," Elodie replied. "I know you by loyalty. I know you operate in the shadows. I know you've probably hurt people to get where you are. And I know that men like you don't change. They just get better at hiding." She turned back to the mural, effectively dismissing him. Jean stood there for a moment, feeling something he hadn't felt since he was a boy in Seoul, powerless and small. "You're right," he said finally, "about most of it." Elodie didn't respond. Jean walked away, hands in his pockets, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight of his choices. Not the money, not the power, but the loneliness of a life built on fear. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a quiet voice whispered that maybe Elodie Beaumont was right. Maybe men like him didn't change. But maybe, just maybe, they could try. 4:39 p.m., Vizcaya Museum Gardens. Jean didn't plan to go to Vizcaya that Thursday. He had a meeting with his accountant, a shipment coming in from Busan that needed his personal attention, and a problem in Little Havana that required the kind of quiet resolution he'd built his reputation on. But when his driver asked where to go after the meeting, Jean heard himself say Vizcaya, because it was Thursday, and Elodie jogged there every Thursday at 4:30. He told himself he just wanted to see her again, to understand why she'd gotten under his skin, to prove to himself that she was just a woman, nothing more, and that this strange pull he felt was nothing he couldn't control. He found her sitting on a stone bench near the garden's eastern terrace, staring out at Biscayne Bay. She wasn't jogging. She was just sitting, her running shoes kicked off beside her, her knees pulled up to her chest. She looked smaller than usual, tired. Jean approached slowly, and this time, she didn't sense him coming. "Bad day?" he asked. Elodie's head snapped up, surprise flickering across her face before she masked it. "Do you just lurk around Miami hoping to run into me? Or is this some kind of advanced stalking?" Jean almost smiled. "A little of both." Elodie sighed and looked back at the water. "I'm not in the mood for whatever this is, Jean." "I'm not here to bother you," Jean said. He gestured to the bench. "May I?" She hesitated, then nodded. Jean sat, leaving a respectful distance between them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic and the soft rustle of palm trees in the breeze. I lost my funding, Elodie said finally, her voice quiet. The grant I've been working on for 8 months. The one that was supposed to expand the after-school program in Overtown. They gave it to someone else. Jin didn't respond immediately. He knew the kind of pain she was feeling, not the same pain, but the shape of it. The frustration of building something with your bare hands only to watch it slip away. I'm sorry, he said, and he meant it. Elodie glanced at him, something like suspicion in her eyes. Why do you care? Jin considered the question. The honest answer was complicated. The safe answer was easier. But sitting there with the base stretching out before them and the weight of her disappointment hanging in the air, Jin found himself choosing honesty. Because you care, he said simply. And I don't meet many people who care about anything the way you care about this. Really looked at him, and Jin felt exposed in a way he hadn't felt in years. Not threatened, not vulnerable in a dangerous way. Just seen. You're not what I expected, she said softly. Neither are you. Elodie turned back to the water. I still don't trust you. You shouldn't. But you're not leaving, are you? Jin didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. He'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross, broken a rule he couldn't repair. And now, sitting beside this woman who represented everything his world told him to avoid, Jin felt the first real crack in the armor he'd spent a lifetime building. No, he said finally. I'm not leaving. Elodie didn't smile, didn't reach for his hand, didn't offer any kind of reassurance. She just nodded, a small, almost imperceptible acknowledgement that something between them had shifted. And Jin, for all his control, for all his careful planning, felt the ground beneath him start to give way. If you felt the tension shift right there, if you sensed something dangerous waking up, subscribe now. You don't want to miss what follows. December 6th, Miami Beach Convention Center. Art Basel Miami Beach was controlled chaos. Over 250 galleries from 36 countries, thousands of collectors, curators, and celebrities, all packed into 5 days of champagne-soaked spectacle. Jin hated it. Too many cameras, too many questions, too many people who wanted to be seen with him without actually knowing who he was. But he went every year, because Art Basel was where deals happened in plain sight, where dirty money became clean through the magic of a bronze sculpture or an abstract painting, where his business partners could meet him without suspicion, shake his hand in front of a Banksy, and discuss shipments while pretending to discuss brushstrokes. This year was different, because this year, Elodie was everywhere. Her gallery had been selected to showcase 3 emerging Haitian American artists, and the installation had become one of the most talked about pieces of the week. Jin saw her face in the Miami Herald, in Art Forum, on the local news. Elodie Beaumont, the curator who was reshaping Miami's art landscape with radical inclusivity. Jin should have stayed away, should have kept to his scheduled meetings and avoided the sections where her work was displayed. But on the 3rd night of Art Basel, at 8:47 p.m., he found himself standing in front of her installation. It was stunning. 3 large-scale mixed-media pieces that combined painting, sculpture, and video projection to tell the story of Haitian migration to Miami. The central piece showed a boat, half destroyed, half transformed into wings. The message was clear. Survival is its own kind of flight. It's about hope, a voice said beside him. Jin turned to find Elodie standing there, holding a glass of champagne, wearing a black cocktail dress that made her look like she belonged in a museum herself. I thought it was about trauma, Jin said. Elodie smiled, but there was sadness in it. It's both. That's the point. You can't have one without the other. Jin looked back at the installation, seeing it differently now. It's beautiful. Thank you. They stood there in silence, surrounded by the noise and spectacle of Art Basel, and for a moment, Jin felt like they were the only 2 people in the room. I didn't think you'd come, Elodie said softly. I didn't plan to. But you're here. Jean met her eyes. I'm here. Elodie took a sip of her champagne, her gaze never leaving his. This is a mistake, isn't it? Whatever this is between us. Probably. Then why aren't you walking away? Jean didn't have an answer. Or maybe he did, and he just wasn't ready to say it out loud. Because the truth was, Elodie Beaumont had become the most dangerous thing in his life. Not because she threatened his business or his reputation, but because she made him want to be someone different. Someone better. And that kind of wanting could cost him everything. Jean. The voice cut through the moment like a knife. Jean turned to see Park Sung-ho, one of his oldest business associates from Seoul, walking toward them with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Sung-ho was old money, old world, and old rules. He was also one of the investors who expected Jean to maintain appearances. Sung-ho, Jean said evenly, switching to Korean. I didn't know you were in town. Surprise visit, Sung-ho replied in Korean, his eyes flicking to Elodie with barely concealed disdain. I wanted to see what all the fuss was about. He switched to English, his accent thick. And who is this lovely lady? Jean felt his jaw tighten. This is Elodie Beaumont. She curated this installation. Sung-ho's smile widened, but there was nothing warm about it. Ah, yes. I read about you in the paper. Very progressive. Elodie extended her hand, her expression polite, but cold. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Park. Sung-ho took her hand briefly, then turned back to Jean, switching to Korean again. We need to talk. Privately. Jean glanced at Elodie, seeing the understanding in her eyes. She knew she was being dismissed. Knew she didn't belong in whatever conversation was about to happen. And the fact that she knew, that she could see how his world worked, made Jin's chest tighten with something that felt like shame. Excuse me, Elodie said quietly, and walked away before Jean could stop her. Jean watched her go, feeling the distance between them grow with every step, and knew that this moment, this public, unavoidable collision of his two worlds, was going to cost him something he couldn't afford to lose. If your heart just tightened, if you're scared of what this choice might cost, subscribe now. This story doesn't let go. 11:06 p.m., Fisher Island Ferry Terminal. Jean found Elodie sitting on a bench near the ferry terminal, staring out at the lights of downtown Miami. She'd left Art Basel without saying goodbye, and it had taken Jean 20 minutes and 3 phone calls to figure out where she'd gone. You shouldn't be here alone, Jean said as he approached. Elodie didn't turn around. I'm fine. Jean sat beside her, close enough to feel the tension radiating from her body. What Sung-ho said was exactly what I expected, Elodie interrupted. You don't have to apologize for him. I'm not apologizing for him. I'm apologizing for putting you in that situation. Elodie finally looked at him, and Jean saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before. Not anger, not disappointment, just a quiet, bone-deep exhaustion. This won't work, she said. You know that, right? Whatever this is between us, it won't work because your world won't let it work. Jean wanted to argue, wanted to tell her she was wrong, that he could make it work, that he had the power to control his own life. But the words died in his throat because they both knew she was right. I don't care about my world, Jean said finally. I care about you. Elodie's laugh was bitter. You can't separate the two, Jean. You are your world. The money, the power, the reputation, that's who you are. And I'm not asking you to change that. I'm just saying I can't be part of it. Then I'll leave it. The words surprised them both. Elodie stared at him, searching his face for signs of deception or delusion. You don't mean that. I do. Jean, you can't just walk away, his voice firm. I've been looking for a reason to walk away for years. I just didn't know it until I met you. Elodie shook her head slowly. You're not hearing me. I'm not asking you to blow up your life for me. I'm not some prize you win by making a grand gesture. I'm telling you that I can't be with you, if it means compromising who I am. And your world, the people you work with, the things you've done, it would compromise me. Every single day, Jean felt the truth of her words settle over him like a weight. She wasn't asking for promises. She wasn't asking for change. She was telling him goodbye. What if I could make it right? Jean asked quietly. What if I could fix the things I've broken? Then do it, Elodie said. Not for me, for yourself. Because a man who needs a woman to be his reason for change isn't really changing. He's just transferring his dependence. Jean looked at her. This woman who saw through every defense he'd ever built and felt something inside him crack open. Not break, just open. Like a door he'd kept locked for so long he'd forgotten what was on the other side. I don't know if I can do this without you, he admitted. Elodie reached over and took his hand. The first time she touched him deliberately, and the warmth of it nearly undid him. Yes, you can, she said gently. And when you do, if you do, maybe we can try again. But not like this. Not while you're still trapped in a life you hate. Jean wanted to argue, wanted to promise her everything would be different starting tomorrow. But he knew better. Change didn't happen in a single night, no matter how much you wanted it to. So instead, he held her hand and watched the lights of Miami shimmer across the water and made a choice that would cost him everything he'd spent 10 years building. He was going to walk away from his world, not for Elodie, for himself. And whatever came after that, whatever consequences, whatever losses, whatever pain, he would face it alone. Because that was the only way to become the kind of man who deserved someone like Elodie Beaumont. 3 weeks later, Coral Gables. Leaving wasn't clean. It wasn't dramatic. It was slow, methodical, and more expensive than Jean had imagined. First came the calls. Somehow, other investors from Seoul. Business partners who trusted him to maintain order in Miami's underground economy. They didn't threaten him, not directly. But they made it clear that walking away would mean burning bridges he couldn't rebuild. Jean burned them anyway. He started liquidating assets. The buildings in Wynwood went first, sold quietly to a developer from New York. Then the restaurants in Brickell, the nightclub in South Beach, the import business that had been his primary front for money laundering. He didn't try to get fair value. He just wanted out. His accountant quit after the third week. His fixer stopped returning calls. His driver, a man who'd worked for him for 6 years, gave 2 weeks' notice and disappeared after one. By the end of January, Jean had lost 60% of his net worth and all of his reputation. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the silence, because Elodie had meant what she said that night at the ferry terminal. She'd told him to change for himself, not for her, and she'd kept her distance while he did it. No calls, no texts, no accidental meetings at coffee shops or museums. Jean had never felt more alone. February 14th, 9:22 a.m., Miami Herald office. Jean sat across from Roberto Diaz, an investigative journalist who'd been digging into Miami's organized crime connections for the better part of a decade. Diaz had written 3 articles about Jean over the years, all speculation, no proof. Now Jean was handing him everything. Why now? Diaz asked, looking at the documents Jean had spread across the desk. Financial records, names of corrupt officials, shipping manifests, everything that could send half of Miami's business elite to prison. Because I'm tired, Jean said simply. Diaz raised an eyebrow. That's it? You're tired? I'm tired of pretending, Jean clarified. I'm tired of building things that don't matter. I'm tired of being someone I hate. Diaz leaned back in his chair, studying Jean with the kind of sharp attention that had made him one of the best investigative reporters in Florida. This will destroy you. You know that, right? The people you're naming, they'll come after you. Let them. Jean. I'm not asking for protection, Jean interrupted. I'm not asking for anonymity. I'm just asking you to tell the truth. Diaz looked at the documents again, then back at Jean. And what happens to you after the truth comes out? Jean stood, buttoning his jacket. I become someone new. Or I don't. Either way, it's better than what I was. He left the office without looking back. The article ran 2 weeks later. Front page of the Miami Herald. It named names, detailed operations, exposed a network of corruption that had been hiding in plain sight for over a decade. Jin's phone rang nonstop for 3 days. Lawyers, former partners, people who wanted to kill him, and people who wanted to thank him. He ignored them all, because consequences don't ask permission. They just arrive, and Jean had finally stopped running from them. If you're still here, it means you care. Subscribe now, because the next choice will break someone. March 3rd, 7:18 p.m., Elodie's apartment, Coconut Grove. Elodie read the Miami Herald article 3 times before she let herself believe it. She'd seen Jin's name in the paper before, always in the society pages, always vague, always protected by lawyers and carefully worded disclaimers. But this was different. This was a confession, a map of every illegal thing he'd ever done, delivered to the public without excuse or justification. She didn't call him, didn't text, didn't reach out in any way, because she needed to think, needed to process what it meant that the man she'd started to care about had built his fortune on the exact kind of exploitation she'd spent her life fighting against. The knock on her door came at 7:18 p.m. Elodie knew it was Jean before she opened it. She could feel his presence the way you feel a storm coming. He looked different, thinner, tired. His suit was still expensive, but it hung on him differently now, like armor he'd stopped believing in. His eyes were the same, though dark, intense, and filled with something that looked like hope. I know I shouldn't be here, Jean said before she could speak. But I needed you to hear this from me. Not from the paper. Not from speculation. From me. Elodie crossed her arms, the familiar gesture of self-protection. Come in. Jean stepped inside, and Elodie closed the door behind him. Her apartment was small, warm, filled with plants and art and the kind of lived-in comfort that came from actually building a life instead of buying one. Jean looked around like he was seeing a museum, and maybe he was. I read the article, Elodie said, moving to the kitchen and pouring herself a glass of wine. She didn't offer him one. All of it. Then you know what I was, Elodie repeated, tasting the words. Is that what this is? Past tense? You destroy half of Miami's power structure and suddenly you're redeemed. Jean flinched, but he didn't defend himself. No, I'm not redeemed. I don't know if I ever will be. But I'm trying to be different. Elodie took a long sip of wine, studying him over the rim of her glass. Why now? Why not 10 years ago? Why not before you built an empire on other people's suffering? Because 10 years ago I didn't have a reason to change, Jean said. I was angry. I was empty. And I filled that emptiness with power, because it was the only thing that made sense. And now, Jean met her eyes. Now I have something to lose. Elodie set her glass down, her hands shaking slightly. I told you not to do this for me. I didn't, Jean said. I did it for myself. Because you were right. I was trapped in a life I hated. And I realized that if I didn't break free now, I never would. You showed me that, Elodie. But I made the choice. Elodie turned away, staring out the window at the lights of Coconut Grove. I don't know if I can trust you. I know. I don't know if I want to. I know that too. Elodie turned back to face him, and Jean saw tears in her eyes for the first time. You hurt people, Jean. People who couldn't defend themselves. People who trusted the wrong person and paid for it with their livelihoods, their families, their lives. How do I reconcile that with the man standing in my living room? Jean didn't have an answer, because she was right. The things he'd done couldn't be undone. The people he'd hurt couldn't be unharmed. And no amount of confession or cooperation with investigators could change that. I don't know, Jean admitted. All I can tell you is that I'm trying to make it right. I'm testifying against people who are still doing what I did. I'm using what's left of my money to fund legal defenses for people who got caught in the system I helped build. It's not enough. It'll never be enough. But it's all I have. Elodie wiped her eyes, her jaw set with the same determination Jean had seen that first day in the gallery. I need time. I understand. And I need honesty. Complete honesty. No more secrets. No more half-truths. If we're going to try this, and I'm not saying we are, I need to know everything. Jean nodded. Ask me anything. So Elodie did. She asked him about the first illegal thing he'd ever done. About the people he'd hurt. About the choices he'd made and the justifications he'd used. And Jean answered every question, no matter how painful, no matter how damning. They talked until 2 a.m. Sometimes Elodie cried. Sometimes she got angry. Sometimes she just sat in silence, processing the weight of what he was telling her. And when it was over, when there were no more questions to ask and no more answers to give, Elodie walked Jean to the door. I'm not ready to forgive you, she said softly. I don't know if I ever will be. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Jean replied. I'm just asking for a chance to be better. Elodie looked at him, really looked at him, and saw something she hadn't expected to see. Not redemption, not absolution, just a man trying to climb out of a hole he'd dug for himself. One chance, she said. And if you lie to me, if you hide anything, if you slip back into who you were, we're done. Forever. Jean felt the weight of that promise settle over him. I won't waste it. Elodie nodded, then closed the door. Jean stood in the hallway for a long moment, feeling the ghost of possibility and the very real weight of consequence, and knew that this was just the beginning. The hard part was still ahead. April 12th, Federal Courthouse, downtown Miami. The courtroom smelled like old wood and anxiety. Jean sat at the witness stand, hand on the Bible, and prepared to tell the truth in a way that would send 6 people to prison and destroy dozens of careers. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Sandra Reyes, walked him through the testimony methodically. Dates, transactions, names. Jean answered every question with the same calm precision he'd once used to plan his illegal operations. Across the room, his former business partners sat in tailored suits, their lawyers whispering strategies, their eyes burning with the kind of hatred that comes from betrayal. Jean met their gazes without flinching. He'd made his choice. He would live with it. The defense attorney, a man named Harold Brennan who'd made a career defending Miami's elite, approached the stand with the confidence of someone who'd never lost a case. Mr. Dokgo, Brennan began, his voice smooth as silk. You expect this court to believe that after 10 years of criminal activity, you suddenly developed a conscience? No, Jean said evenly. I expect this court to use my testimony to convict people who are still committing crimes. Brennan smiled. How convenient. And I suppose your newfound morality has nothing to do with the woman you've been seen with? Miss Elodie Beaumont, isn't it? Jean felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. My relationship with Miss Beaumont is not relevant to this case. Isn't it? Brennan pressed. You met her in November. By February, you're liquidating your assets and cooperating with federal investigators. Seems like quite a coincidence. It's not a coincidence, Jean admitted. Meeting Elodie made me realize I wanted to be someone different. But the choice to testify was mine alone. Brennan walked closer, his eyes sharp. And in making this choice, you've destroyed your reputation, lost millions of dollars, and made powerful enemies. All for what? Love. Jean looked at the defense attorney, then at the jury, then at the gallery where Elodie sat in the back row, her face carefully neutral. No, Jean said quietly. For myself. Because I was tired of being the kind of man who could only build things by destroying others. The courtroom was silent. Even Brennan seemed momentarily thrown. No further questions, the attorney said finally, and returned to his seat. Jin stepped down from the witness stand, walked past his former partners without looking at them, and left the courthouse knowing he'd just burned the last bridge to his old life. Outside, the Miami sun was brutal and bright. Jin stood on the courthouse steps, loosening his tie, and tried to remember who he'd been before he became Dokgo Jin, the feared and respected power broker. He couldn't. That boy was gone, buried under years of choices and consequences. But maybe Jin thought he could become someone new. Someone who didn't need fear to feel powerful. Someone who didn't need control to feel safe. The question was, what kind of man did he want to be? Elodie appeared beside him, not touching, just present. She didn't ask how it went, didn't offer comfort or congratulations, just stood with him in the harsh sunlight and let him feel the weight of what he'd done. Thank you for being here, Jin said. I didn't come for you, Elodie said. I came because I needed to see if you'd go through with it. And you did. Jin looked at her, this woman who'd become his mirror and his measure, and felt something like gratitude. Now you figure out who you are without the power, without the money, without the reputation. And I figure out if the man you become is someone I can love. And if he's not, then at least you'll know you tried. Jin nodded, feeling the truth of it settle in his chest. There were no guarantees, no promises, just the slow, painful work of becoming someone different. But for the first time in his life, Jin thought that might be enough. If you're still here, it means you care. Subscribe now because the next choice will break someone. 6 months later, October 18th, Overtown Cultural Center. Jin stood in the back of the Overtown Cultural Center, watching Elodie give a speech about the new youth arts program that had just received full funding from the city. She wore a green dress that made her skin glow, her hair natural and free, her voice strong and clear as she thanked the community for their support. She didn't mention Jin, didn't acknowledge him, and he was grateful for that, because the past 6 months had been about learning to exist without needing recognition, without needing power, without needing to be seen. After the trial, Jin had done what he'd promised. He'd testified in 4 more cases. He'd used what remained of his money to fund legal aid clinics in Little Havana and Overtown. He'd met with families whose lives had been destroyed by the system he'd helped build, and he'd apologized without expecting forgiveness. Most of them didn't forgive him. Some did. All of them saw him, really saw him, in a way no one had when he was powerful. Jin had also gotten a job. Nothing prestigious, nothing glamorous, just work at a nonprofit that helped formerly incarcerated people find employment. The pay was minimal. The work was hard, but it was real in a way his old life had never been. He and Elodie had been taking things slowly. Dinners once a week, walks through Coconut Grove, conversations that lasted until sunrise. She never let him hide, never let him slip back into the polished, controlled version of himself. She called him out when he was being defensive. She celebrated with him when he was being honest. It wasn't easy. Some days Jin missed the power, missed the respect that came from fear, missed feeling like he mattered in the world. But then Elodie would look at him, really look at him, and he'd remember that matching to one person in a real way was worth more than matching to thousands in a false one. After the speech, Jin waited outside while Elodie said goodbye to community members and donors. The night was warm, the air thick with the smell of jasmine and distant rain. Miami felt different now. Smaller, more intimate, like a city he was learning to love instead of control. You came, Elodie said when she finally emerged, her heels in her hand, her face tired but happy. I told you I would. You did. She walked over and stood beside him, Close but not touching. That was their rhythm now. Closeness with respect. Intimacy with boundaries. You were incredible up there, Jean said. Thank you. They started walking, no particular destination in mind, just moving through the night, the way they'd been moving through life together, carefully, intentionally, one step at a time. I got my 6-month review at work, Jean said after a while, and they said I'm doing well, that I'm good with people, that I listen. Elodie smiled. You are good with people, when you're not trying to control them. Jean laughed, the sound still unfamiliar but getting easier. I'm learning. They walked in comfortable silence until they reached Elodie's car. She turned to face him, her expression serious. I've been thinking, she said. Jean felt his chest tighten. About us, about whether this is working. Jean waited, not defending, not deflecting, just listening. And I think it is, Elodie continued. Not perfectly, not easily, but it's working because you're doing the work. You're showing up. You're being honest. You're becoming someone I can trust. Jean felt something in his chest loosen. So what does that mean? Elodie stepped closer, close enough that Jean could smell her perfume, close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. It means I'm willing to try. Really try. Not just dinners and walks, but something real. Jean reached out slowly, giving her time to step back, and when she didn't, he took her hand. Her fingers were warm, strong, and they fit in his like they'd been designed for it. I'm scared, Jean admitted. Scared I'll mess this up. Scared I'll slip back into who I was. Scared I'm not good enough for you. You probably will mess up, Elodie said with brutal honesty. You'll make mistakes. You'll have bad days. You'll probably hurt me without meaning to. But if you're honest about it, if you keep trying to be better, then we'll figure it out together. Jean pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers, and felt the weight of the past 6 months, the loss, the pain, the slow rebuilding, settle into something that felt almost like peace. I love you, he said. The first time he'd said it out loud. Elodie smiled, tears in her eyes. I know. I've known for a while. And I love you too. The man you're becoming, not the man you were. Jean kissed her then, soft and slow, and felt something he'd never felt before. Not possession, not control, just connection, just love. When they pulled apart, Elodie laughed softly. This is still going to be complicated. I know. People are going to judge us. Let them. Your old world might come back. Then we'll deal with it together. Elodie studied him, searching for doubt or deception, and found only truth. Okay, she said finally. Together. They stood there in the parking lot of the Overtown Cultural Center, two people from different worlds who'd found each other in the mess and chaos of change, and chose to build something new. Not perfect, not easy, but real. And that, Jean thought, was worth more than any empire he'd ever built. Jean sat on the beach at Key Biscayne, watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. Beside him, Elodie dozed with her head on his shoulder, a blanket wrapped around both of them. They'd been up all night talking about the future, about whether Jean should go back to school, about whether they should move in together, about whether love was enough when the world kept throwing complications at you. They hadn't solved anything, but they talked, honestly, openly, without fear. Jin's phone buzzed with a text from his boss at the nonprofit. Another client needed help. Another person trying to rebuild their life after prison. Another chance for Jean to be useful in a way that mattered. Elodie stirred, opening her eyes and smiling sleepily. What time is it? Almost 6. We should go home. Yeah. But neither of them moved. They just sat there, watching the sun rise over the ocean, and felt the quiet satisfaction of having survived something they weren't sure they would. Jean, Elodie said softly. Yeah. Thank you. For what? For choosing this. For choosing us. Jean kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair, and felt the truth of what he'd learned over the past 18 months settle into his bones. Power can buy silence, but love demands truth. And truth, Jean had learned, was the only thing worth building a life on. If this story stayed with you, if it felt real, subscribe, like, and share it with someone who still believes people can change.